Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
You ever sit across from someone you love and wonder, just for a second, if they're looking at you or through you? That moment when something flickers in their face, something they probably think they're hiding, and suddenly you realize you've been living in a story someone else wrote, and they cast you in a role without even asking. I had that moment about 2 months before what was supposed to be my wedding, right in the middle of a Wednesday night dinner, sitting on Brad's worn-down leather couch, watching him scroll through emails like I didn't exist. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, or at least what I thought was the beginning. The night Brad proposed. It was nothing flashy, just us in the backyard under a string of dim patio lights. Him fumbling with the box like it was burning his hand, telling me I was the most stable person he'd ever known, which, in hindsight, was a hell of a thing to say in a proposal. But at the time, I laughed, mistaking that awkward phrasing for sincerity, because after years of dating guys who were either allergic to commitment or addicted to chaos, I was tired. I didn't need fireworks. I needed something solid, or so I thought. Brad wasn't exciting, but he was dependable. An accountant, the kind who always wore brown shoes and beige button-downs, who had a filing system for his grocery lists. His family was picture perfect from the outside. Dad, a retired engineer, mom, a stay-at-home church volunteer. Older brother Sean, always cracking jokes. Divorced, but friendly. I didn't grow up with a Norman Rockwell setup myself. My parents were gone, a car crash when I was 25, no siblings, just me and the occasional distant cousin who popped up when someone died or got married. So I'll admit it, I was drawn to the idea of family, of belonging. That might have been my first mistake, assuming they wanted me as I was, not as a placeholder. At first, the little things didn't bother me. Linda, Brad's mom, would drop comments about how I didn't cook like his ex used to, or how I didn't have much family to invite, so thank God the guest list won't be too bloated. She said it with that tight smile women of her generation have mastered, like sugar-glazed poison, and Brad would just chuckle and say, "She means well," like that was some kind of excuse. And maybe it would have been, if it had stopped there. But it didn't. Every month, a new layer peeled back. Brad insisted we keep our finances semi-combined for wedding planning, his words. And I didn't push back too hard because I had savings, a steady job in graphic design, and figured it was normal to share expenses when you're building a life together. Except the split wasn't even. I noticed he stopped picking up dinners, stopped covering utilities, and whenever I brought it up, he'd pivot to something else. My student loans, or how his job was less flexible right now because of some vague audit season that seemed to last 6 months. Then there was the wedding planning. I offered to hire a planner. He said no, his mom would handle it, which meant Linda started emailing me daily schedules, expected dress fittings at 9 in the morning on weekdays, and passive-aggressive notes like, "Thought you'd want my input since you don't have a mother to help." I didn't respond. I was tired of fighting fights that felt like quicksand. You argue, you sink. You stay quiet, you float for a while. But the moment that shook me loose was quiet, small, almost forgettable. I had come home early from a client meeting, one of those rainy Wednesdays where everything smells like wet pavement and traffic sweat. Brad didn't hear me come in. He was in the den, door cracked, talking on the phone, pacing. I stood still in the hallway, not meaning to eavesdrop, not at first. But then I heard him say it, and something inside me, something brittle I didn't know I had, just snapped. "No, man, it's perfect. She's good with money, doesn't ask a lot of questions, and with her job, the joint filing's gonna look sweet. It's like a tax break with benefits." Silence, laughter. His brother's voice, probably Sean. "Damn, you're really marrying her for the deduction, Brad." "It's not like that. I mean, I like her, but this makes sense, right? She's stable, and she's not high maintenance." More laughter. I stepped back so hard I nearly tripped over my own shoes. I stood there for a minute, then turned around, walked right back out the door, sat in my car for 15 minutes with the engine off, windshield wipers squeaking across glass that didn't need cleaning. My hands were shaking. Not from sadness, no, not yet, but from the slow rising heat of realization. It wasn't that Brad didn't love me. It was worse. He loved what I provided. The stability, the savings, the silence. I didn't confront him. Not that night, not the next. I smiled when he made dinner, nodded when he talked about the wedding, kissed him on the cheek before bed. But I was watching now, taking mental notes, quietly pulling threads, and the more I pulled, the more the whole sweater unraveled. Let me ask you something. Have you ever ignored red flags because it was easier to believe the lie than to face the truth? What would you have done at that dinner table? Because I'll tell you this much. I didn't plan to make a scene. I planned to make a statement. And they never saw it coming. There's a certain kind of numbness that sets in once you realize the person you were planning to spend your life with may have never really seen you as anything more than a means to an end. A useful piece in their carefully managed puzzle. Something efficient, convenient, and quietly profitable. It doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly, like the way water seeps through drywall after a pipe leak. Silent, gradual, and inevitable. After I heard that phone call between Brad and Sean, I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't pack a suitcase, and storm out into the night like they do in movies. No, I did something worse. I stayed, I smiled, and I started listening. Because once you stop assuming people have good intentions, you start seeing the world in terrifying detail. Every little action becomes data. Every silence becomes a strategy. And every joke, especially the cruel, casually dropped ones, becomes a confession. The next morning, Brad was all sunshine and oatmeal, telling me he'd booked a tasting at some vineyard his mom found. He made a comment about how tightening up the budget now would give us more to work with later, like I hadn't already covered the deposit on the venue, paid half for the florist, and been the one handling all the vendor calls while he played the "I'm swamped at work" card over and over. I nodded and smiled, sipping my coffee while my mind quietly cataloged the discrepancies in the joint wedding spreadsheet I had built, the one he somehow never updated. That afternoon, I called my friend Janelle. She'd been my ride or die since college, the one who told me to dump my last boyfriend when he said he wasn't into labels, but still slept with other people behind my back. She listened to my voice, let me talk without interrupting, and when I finally told her what I'd heard, word for word, she didn't gasp, didn't yell. She just said, "You need to start protecting yourself, right now." We met up that night at a bar down the street from her apartment, the kind of place with strong whiskey, dim lights, and booths deep enough to keep secrets. I slid into the seat across from her, clutching a folder I had started the night before. Nothing dramatic, just a few bank statements, a screenshot of Brad's open tab with a tax estimate calculator, and the beginnings of a list titled, "Who Benefits If We Marry?" in neat, bullet-pointed type. Janelle looked through it without flinching, then glanced up and asked, "Do you want out, or do you want justice?" And that was the first time I realized I didn't want to just disappear. I didn't want to be the woman who left quietly, who got replaced before the registry items even shipped. I didn't want to just escape. I wanted the truth laid bare, stripped down, impossible to ignore. I wanted to hold a mirror up to Brad and his family and force them to look at the ugliness they kept hidden behind polite dinners and fake smiles. I wanted to watch Linda's face crumble. I wanted to see Sean run out of smug jokes, so I made a decision. The first step was paperwork. I called an old client, a lawyer who specialized in prenups and asset protections, and asked for a consultation. When he picked up the phone, he sounded surprised to hear from me, but as soon as I explained what I needed, his tone shifted. I told him I wasn't getting married to screw anyone over. I was making sure I wasn't the one being screwed. He helped me draft a prenup, not the kind that protects Brad, but the kind that would raise every red flag imaginable if he refused to sign it. A document that outlined very specific financial boundaries, made it clear I wasn't responsible for any of his family's debts, and included clauses that would alert authorities if fraud or coercion was suspected in any shared filings. While we worked on that, I started digging. I went through Brad's emails when he left his laptop open, scanned credit card statements for odd charges, and even reached out to a contact in tax consulting to get a second opinion on what Brad had to gain from marrying someone in my income bracket. What I found wasn't shocking, not anymore. It was just confirmation. His family business had been quietly bleeding money for the last 3 years. The books were cooked just enough to survive an audit, but cracked beneath the surface. They'd pulled loans, dipped into retirement accounts, and were relying on a fresh injection of assets from Brad's upcoming marriage to stabilize things. And I was that injection. It was around this time that Linda began ramping up her wedding involvement. As if she sensed something was shifting, she emailed me spreadsheets of seating charts, links to wedding gowns I hadn't asked for, and instructions for how to handle the rehearsal dinner that she had already planned without asking me. She signed one of her notes with a cheery line, "So glad you'll be part of our family soon. We've needed a steady woman around here for years." The words made my stomach twist. I didn't reply. I didn't call her. I didn't cancel the dinner she was planning for the 2 families to meet either. I kept showing up. I kept smiling. And every time I looked at Brad across the dinner table, every time he said something benign and unmemorable, I asked myself, is this the man I was going to build a life with? Or the man I'm about to destroy with a single envelope? One night, after another fake laugh dinner with his parents, I came home, poured myself a glass of wine, and opened his laptop again. I knew his password. It was our anniversary, ironically enough. There, saved in his draft folder, was a document titled Joint Filing Estimate 2025. When I opened it, I saw it. Projected savings of over $36,000. A chart detailing the benefits of filing married versus single, with a side note about my income bracket making it ideal for deduction optimization. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I was shocked anymore, but because it was all laid out in such clinical, impersonal language. I was a line item, a calculated advantage. So I smiled to myself, closed the laptop, and made a folder of my own. Because I knew then that the dinner where it would all end was coming soon. And they wouldn't see it coming, not from the woman they thought was too polite, too nice, too naive to bite back. There's a strange calm that settles over you when you already know how the story ends. When every word spoken around you becomes background noise because the final scene is already written, and you're the one holding the pen. I didn't just walk into that dinner expecting betrayal. I walked in rehearsed in silence, rehearsed in solitude, rehearsed in the kind of anger that burns slow instead of flaring fast, the kind that doesn't scream or sob, but sits perfectly still with a half smile and a folder tucked neatly into a leather handbag. The night was planned as a celebration of unity, or so Linda put it in her glossy email, with pastel-colored font and a nauseating subject line that read, "Our family's becoming one," with 3 exclamation points that made me want to throw my phone across the room. It was to be hosted at their family's lake house, a 2-story display of earned wealth that had seen better days, but was kept alive by sheer willpower and air freshener. Linda had spent the week sending me Pinterest boards of rustic chic tablescapes, charcuterie platters shaped like hearts, and dessert options with captions like, "Sugar for the sweet bride-to-be." She still didn't know that I hadn't been sweet in weeks. I had turned into something else, something colder, something sharper. Janelle offered to drive me, even suggested I cancel last minute and make a statement by absence, but I told her this wasn't about statements anymore. It was about spectacle, and sometimes you have to hand-deliver the match before the house can burn. When I arrived, Linda greeted me in a satin blouse that looked one size too small and kissed me on the cheek like she hadn't spent the last 2 months micromanaging my wedding into her personal fantasy. Brad stood behind her, smiling that same unbothered smile he always wore in moments that required a spine he didn't have. His arm slid around my waist like it always did in public, a silent claim, a casual gesture meant to communicate belonging and possession in the same breath. I leaned into it because I knew it would be the last time I'd ever let him touch me. We were seated at a long, over-decorated table in the backyard under a canopy of string lights. the kind that tried too hard to look whimsical, but only served to highlight the uneven lawn and the cracked tiles by the patio. Peter, Brad's father, sat silently at the end like some ancient judge, rarely speaking, always watching, while Linda floated around refilling glasses, and Sean, Brad's brother and the smug mouthpiece of the family, dominated the conversation with inappropriate jokes and thinly veiled digs at modern women who don't know how to keep a home. I smiled politely, sipped my wine, and let it all wash over me like a tide I no longer had to swim against. Dinner was served, some overcooked chicken and limp asparagus, but no one cared about the food. This wasn't about the meal. It was about appearances, about presenting the illusion of warmth, unity, and joy for a union that was never built on love, but on logistics, money, and maintaining a carefully curated family image. And then, somewhere between the second glass of wine and the lemon tart that Linda bought but claimed she baked, Sean leaned back in his chair, chuckled to himself, and tossed out the sentence that detonated everything. "Well," he said, lifting his glass, "guess we're marrying her for the tax breaks, huh?" The laughter that followed wasn't loud or malicious. It was casual, thoughtless, the kind of laughter people let slip when they forget you're still in the room, when they've already decided your role, your purpose, and your expiration date. Brad gave a weak chuckle, didn't look at me, and Linda smiled like it was all just good fun, harmless banter between soon-to-be relatives. No one noticed the shift in my expression, the way my lips pressed together, not in pain, not even in shock, but in confirmation. I waited until the laughter died down. I waited until the wine glasses settled back on the table, until Linda picked up her napkin and dabbed the corner of her mouth, until Brad turned toward me with that oblivious look he wore when he thought everything was just fine. Then I reached into my bag, took off the engagement ring, and placed it gently on the table, right next to his fork. The silence that followed wasn't immediate, it lagged, like the room needed a second to catch up with what had just happened, like reality had been punctured and no one knew how to breathe through the hole. Brad blinked, confused. Linda froze mid-reach, and Sean raised an eyebrow, still smirking like he thought this was part of some joke. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, steady, almost soft. "I thought you all might want to see this," I said, and slid the manila folder across the table toward Linda, who reached for it with the tentative hands of someone who already knew they didn't want to know what was inside. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning the first page. A prenup, perfectly legal, airtight, and very much not in her son's favor. She flipped to the second page, documentation from my lawyer outlining the discovery of financial inconsistencies tied to Brad's family business, cross-referenced with conversations overheard, screen captures, and bank records. Page 3 was a letter pre-addressed to the IRS, with a courtesy note about suspicious filing behavior and potential tax manipulation. Linda's face drained of color so fast it looked like she'd been slapped. Her mouth opened, then closed again without sound. Brad reached for the folder, but I pulled it back before he could touch it. "This isn't about revenge," I said, standing slowly. "It's about clarity. You wanted a transaction, you wanted stable, you wanted silence. I gave you all of it for a while, but I'm not your investment." The words landed like stones in a pond, ripples spreading outward until no one could speak. Brad stammered something, a pathetic attempt at damage control, but I didn't stay to listen. I walked to the end of the table, picked up my clutch, and paused only long enough to glance at Peter, who looked down at his plate as if it might offer him a way out of the moment. As I walked away down the uneven steps and into the night, I didn't feel powerful, not exactly. I felt clear, empty, free. They had underestimated the quiet woman at the table, and they had no idea what was coming next. There is a moment, split-second thin, but so dense with weight, it feels like an avalanche wrapped in silence, when the room no longer belongs to anyone but you, and every eye, every breath, every heartbeat is suspended in a gravity you created. That was the moment I felt as Linda turned the first page of that folder, with fingers trembling just enough to betray how much control she always thought she had. and how quickly it was slipping through the cracks of her perfect dinner party facade. For the first time since I met that family, I was no longer the outsider trying to impress or assimilate. I was the one holding the match, and they were sitting in the kindling, still smiling like nothing could burn them. The document she held wasn't just paper, it was precision. The prenup, crafted carefully by my lawyer over the course of a week and framed in neutral legalese, stated that in the event of marriage, all assets prior to the union would remain separate. All joint filings would require written and notarized consent from both parties, and any attempt to obscure, manipulate, or take advantage of tax incentives through misrepresentation would result in immediate legal dissolution, financial penalties, and a mandatory audit. It was written not as a threat, but as a line in the sand, the kind no one could cross without leaving footprints too deep to deny. Page 2 was worse. It held documentation, courtesy of the private investigator Janelle's friend had connected me with. Printouts of the family business's crumbling financials, hidden loans, leveraged assets that had been quietly used to cover operational losses, and internal communications indicating that the business was barely floating, tethered to survival by a single upcoming merger, which, upon closer inspection, seemed more like a personal salvation plan disguised as romantic commitment. There were emails where Brad had mentioned projected household savings post-marriage, with actual figures and breakdowns. One spreadsheet included my income logged beside his, with color-coded highlights indicating combined bracket advantages. I was a line item, a statistic, a solution. The third and final item in the folder was the one that made Linda's face fold in on itself like paper in rain. It was a copy of a letter addressed to the IRS, not submitted, but formatted, dated, and ready for delivery, complete with exhibits, attachments, and a timeline of events that, when read consecutively, painted a very clear picture. A picture of coordinated financial benefit tied to a marriage that was never about love, but leverage. My name on those documents wasn't just a fiancé anymore. It was a whistleblower in waiting. I let them sit with that. I didn't say a word. I wanted the silence to stretch long enough for it to sink into their bones, for every smirk to vanish, and every assumption to shatter. Brad reached out, almost in slow motion, his voice thin and papery as he asked, "Where did you get this?" As if the question could somehow change what was already exposed. I looked at him for the first time since I placed the ring on the table, and I saw not a man in love, or even a man in shock. I saw a man caught, and that's a very different kind of face. "I got it," I said slowly, "because I started paying attention. You should try it sometime." Linda's lip quivered as she leaned forward, whispering something to Brad I couldn't hear, but I saw the fear start to crawl across her expression, that unique panic that only appears when people realize the stories they've told themselves are unraveling in front of witnesses. Sean, the source of the dinner table joke that opened the gates, was no longer smug. He sat back in his chair, mouth tight, watching me like a dog watching a storm. Peter remained silent, as always, but his hand gripped the stem of his wine glass with a force that made his knuckles bleach white. "I'm not marrying your son," I said quietly, standing with a calm I had rehearsed for days. "I'm not becoming part of this family, and I'm certainly not becoming a tax strategy." Brad started to protest, reaching for me like physical contact could bridge the gaping canyon between what we were and what I had become in his mind. No longer the loving, flexible woman who handled things quietly, who smoothed over tension and forgave every small slight, but someone who had already seen the end of the movie and refused to stick around for the credits. "You can't just do this," he stammered, blinking like someone trying to find the edges of a dream. "You're overreacting. It was a joke." "That's the problem," I replied, stepping away. "It wasn't." I left them there, 4 adults staring at their reflections in the shards of their own manipulation, surrounded by wine glasses and centerpieces, decorative linen napkins folded into roses, and a tension so thick I could feel it chasing me down the steps and across the lawn. I didn't rush. I wanted them to watch me leave. I wanted them to sit in the silence after the door shut, knowing they'd underestimated the woman they tried to purchase like a damn asset. By the time I reached the parking lot, Janelle was already there, leaning against her car with her arms crossed and a look that blended pride with concern. She didn't say anything right away. She didn't have to. I got in, fastened my seatbelt, and took one last breath before the engine turned over. The ride back was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of decisions, full of the echo of their laughter turning to horror, and full of the realization that silence, when weaponized properly, is louder than any scream. They would tell themselves 100 stories about what I did, call me dramatic, unstable, vindictive, maybe even cold, but I didn't need their version of the truth. I had mine, and it was written in legal terms, documented by timestamps, and sealed by a ring they would never see again. And the best part? I still hadn't sent the folder to the IRS, not yet. There's a peculiar stillness that follows the collapse of a carefully constructed lie, a kind of emotional aftermath that doesn't come with fireworks or applause, but instead arrives in whispers and half-empty inboxes, in late-night voicemails that reek of desperation disguised as regret, and in the quiet realization that you are no longer tethered to a version of life that never truly belonged to you. In the days that followed the dinner, which by now I imagine they will only refer to in hushed tones as the incident, I didn't cry, I didn't pace around waiting for a knock at my door, and I certainly didn't second-guess what I had done. I slept. I slept better than I had in months, maybe even years, because for the first time in a long time, I had reclaimed something that had slowly been eroded by manipulation dressed up as love, my sense of agency, my ability to say no, and my refusal to play the role they had written for me behind closed doors. The morning after the dinner, my phone began buzzing before sunrise, not in panic, not in fury, but with a kind of brittle urgency that tried to sound casual and failed miserably. Brad left 3 voicemails before breakfast, all of them starting with forced calm and ending with his voice cracking under the pressure of his own unraveling. The first was an apology laced with excuses, a carefully worded attempt to make me believe he had never really meant what Sean said, followed by a meandering rationalization about stress and miscommunication. The second message leaned into nostalgia, listing all the things we had done together, trying to frame our history as proof that I had misunderstood a single, isolated moment, as if I hadn't spent the past 2 months watching the cracks widen beneath my feet. The third was the most revealing. He said he felt ambushed, as if the real offense had been exposing the truth, not living inside the lie. I didn't return the calls. Linda's email arrived around noon, and I stared at the subject line for a full minute before opening it. "We need to talk. Please read." The body of the message was a fascinating mess of conflicting emotions, a manicured blend of condescension and pleading, with the kind of veiled threats people make when they're too proud to admit they've lost control. She expressed her deep sadness over the misunderstanding, implied that I had overreacted in a moment of stress, and then, in the very next paragraph, accused me of orchestrating a vendetta that could destroy a reputable family. She mentioned the IRS letter without naming it directly, and suggested that no one wins when private matters become public spectacle, a line so drenched in self-preservation, I could practically smell the fear beneath the faux concern. I forwarded the message to my lawyer with a single sentence: "We won't be responding." But even with all the fallout playing out exactly as I had expected, Brad's panic, Linda's scramble, the deafening silence from Peter, who, I assume, chose to stay buried behind his wineglass forever, I found myself floating in a strange emotional limbo, not because I regretted anything, but because I hadn't realized just how much of myself I had sacrificed in the slow march toward that moment. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely happens all at once. It's 1,000 tiny cuts disguised as compromises, brushed off in the name of peace, of love, of practicality, until one day you look down and realize you're bleeding from places you didn't know existed. And once you see it, once the blinders fall and the story changes shape, There's no way to go back to who you were before. Janelle took me out to dinner that Friday night, not as a celebration, but as a kind of ritual, a closing ceremony for a chapter that had ended not with a wedding, but with a folder and a promise I had made to myself in the parking lot of that house, to never again be the woman who confuses being chosen with being valued. She raised her glass in a quiet toast and said, "To peace and to very expensive lessons." And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. The truth is, I had loved Brad once, not in the way you love someone who sets your world on fire, but in the way you love something that feels safe after too many years of chaos. He had been a life raft in a sea of bad decisions, a man who didn't make grand gestures but always showed up on time, who paid his bills and remembered my coffee order. But what I mistook for reliability had been calculation. What I believed was emotional steadiness had been moral vacancy. He wasn't a monster. He was worse than that. He was hollow. And hollowness is dangerous because it lets others pour themselves in, only to find there's no bottom, no echo, just silence. I never sent the folder to the IRS, at least, not yet. It still sits in a drawer in my home office, neatly labeled, perfectly organized, waiting. Not out of mercy, not out of indecision, but because some weapons are more powerful when they remain unsheathed. Brad and his family know it exists. That's enough for now. Let them live with the anticipation, the uncertainty, the long shadow of consequences hovering just outside their field of vision. Let them check the mail with a slight tremble. Let them remember that I could still strike if I chose to. Sometimes justice isn't a storm. Sometimes it's the sound of your own footsteps walking away from people who thought you'd never leave. And as for me, I've started something new, not a relationship, not a revenge mission, just a life that belongs entirely to me. I wake up in a quiet apartment. I work with clients who respect my time, and I take long walks with no destination, because I don't owe anyone an explanation for where I'm going anymore. I've stopped looking for someone to build a future with. I've started building one on my own. Last week, I saw a couple at a cafe downtown, holding hands across the table, whispering, laughing like they were the only two people on earth. For a second, I watched them with a pang in my chest, the kind of ache that comes from remembering what you once hoped for. But then it passed, because I knew something they didn't yet, that love without respect is just performance, and performance, no matter how convincing, always ends when the curtain falls. Some women get the ring, some women get the revenge. And some of us, we walk away with our name, our sanity, and the knowledge that we never really lost anything at all, because I was never theirs to claim in the first place.